Recording is happening. Um, yeah, so I suppose I'll speak a little bit about this journey and how I became interested in grief work as a topic. So, as with many things, it started with something personal. In 2017, I found myself pregnant and in a situation where I did not conceptualize how I could bring this life into the world. So I chose to have an abortion and was really shocked by the lack of space for support, for grief, for holding any of the complexity of that experience, given that it is one that's so common in the UK and many other countries in the world. And it, yeah, really connected me to a deep need to have communal grieving spaces, and maybe quite critically aware of the lack of space for any kind of emotions that don't facilitate productivity, to really have public space or to be validated in the public realm. And I felt quite angry about this. And one of those days I would kind of type in things like abortion rituals, or was looking for anything that could help me to kind of integrate this experience, and there was nothing. Just lots of pro-life things on the internet when you type anything abortion. So I thought, this isn't ideal. And I thought, well, I'm gonna create some practices for myself. I'm going to try and find a way for this experience to become generative, to become something that allows me to expand rather than to constrict and shrink. And in the course of this process and this deep kind of grief spiral that I went into for a few years, I was working at GESA, or the GEN event, and came into conversation with Nessie Reed about our shared desire for more common spaces for grief. I shared what I was going through personally, but then we also spoke about how in the various activist spaces we've been involved in, we felt like grief was sort of the elephant in the room, and something that was often kind of getting in the way of flexible thinking and being really responsive rather than reactive, because so often we're bumping up against each other's pain and each other's unprocessed hurt. And we just thought, you know what, we really need to try and do some work around this. So Nessie set off to look for funding and to try and find some way for me to kind of go into this research process. And it just all came together basically as the pandemic was beginning. So some would say divine timing or comedic timing. I don't know. I am a clown, so I saw the funny side. But yeah, in this journey, it kind of coincided, as I've said, with this collective grief moment that we've all been in, as well as my partner losing a parent and supporting them through that. So it's been quite an involved process. But as of today, actually, we've just launched the toolkit. So I will share it with you, and you can access the tools and the practices. And it's really, yeah, it feels very auspicious to be getting to speak about this today, because, yeah, we meant to have it launched a long time ago, but part of what we're sitting with in this pandemic is, I think we're noticing how much energy things take and how much capacity we have, and how that's reduced by all the different things we have to navigate at this time, and maybe have been navigating for some time, but perhaps haven't noticed in the busyness of our lives and our social events and our distractions. And what I think is so challenging and also potentially rewarding about this pandemic moment is that we're really having to sit with ourselves and so much of the reality of what is happening in the world at this moment, what's happening in our communities. So in terms of some of the learnings, I suppose, from this grief research process, I ultimately feel like grief is a generative force if we allow ourselves to work with it. But it is also something that's incredibly taboo in a lot of the Western world, for lack of a better generalized spatial location. It's something which has been hidden, made secret, something that has become more and more medicalized, something that Suhail and I were talking about earlier, is this way that even in this moment where we have a lot of mental health crises due to the pandemic, there's so much of a sense that we should all just go find therapists and pay professionals to help us with our pain. And don't get me wrong, I have a therapist. I love seeing my therapist, and it's wonderful to be able to access therapy after years of not being able to afford it. But to see this as the only model and the only way that we can hold difficulty, hold challenge, and different mental health experiences, to me does not feel sustainable. And equally, with grief, we tend to kind of medicalize and individualize it. We say, we don't really have space for this, so take your 5 days off, go and see a therapist, and then become productive again. We don't really have narratives around how can this facilitate some kind of initiation within me? How can this allow me to expand, to sort of compost these things that are arising through this loss, and to allow it to really transform me, turn me into someone, a new version of myself, to be in different relationships as a result of this loss, to really allow it to be a kind of alchemizing process. We don't have those conversations in the mainstream, and we don't really have tools around how to do that, or practices around how we could explore that. So I'm hopeful that this offering of this toolkit may create some ripples that can allow people to experiment with showing up to our grief and being in conversation with it a little bit more, and trusting that actually that process of being with it will create more space, will allow us to have more flexible thinking, will allow us to really notice what's important to us, what our values are, and how we can orient more towards them. Because part of, in my opinion, what late stage capitalism and neoliberalism runs off is distraction and bypassing. Whether that's around bypassing our embodied experience and actually noticing how numb or dissociated we might be, how much grief we might be carrying. We generally are taught to kind of dissociate and look away from those things, to not focus on it. And then whether it's our phones or all the other distractions, it's like our attention is being snatched away elsewhere. So by giving ourselves permission to actually focus in, like, what's happening in my body? What sensations are arising? Is there a blockage? Is there some numbness? What would it look like to give yourself permission to be with that? To trust that it has something to tell you, and that it will create more space and more presence. So those are some of the kind of underpinnings, some of the learnings, and I guess offerings that I hope this will make in allowing us to really reconnect with ourselves a little bit more, and learn to expand our capacity to be with discomfort, to be with difficulty, because we're likely to have to learn how to do that with the challenges we face as a global community, and really expand our bandwidth to sit with it and to digest it and become more responsive rather than just reactive. Yeah, what else to say? As always, ancestors and lineage is a really important part of this project and a lot of what I do. And so there are lots and lots of practitioners whose work has been a foundation for this toolkit. Some, not all of them I'm going to name right now, but someone who's incredibly instrumental to this is Sobonfu Some, who's no longer alive. She is a Dagara elder. The Dagara people are an indigenous or traditional culture located in what we now call Burkina Faso in West Africa. And the Dagara have a kind of monthly grief ritual, which is actually taboo for people to miss. And the belief in the Dagara system is that any unprocessed grief becomes harm or violence in the collective. And so they see grief work as something that's actually a collective benefit. They don't individualize it. It's really seen as something that's a relational offering. And so they hold it within community and they have rituals around this. And Sobonfu spent a lot of her life sharing and holding spaces in this kind of Dagara lineage of grief work in the Western world. And I was very lucky to be able to attend one of these grief rituals that she held in 2014 when I was living in California. And it was kind of the first introduction to a held grief space I'd ever had. So she's a very deep, deep thread and ancestor that's kind of woven through this work, and this very, very grateful to her. Her former partner, Malidoma Some, who also recently passed, was very sad at his passing. He did a lot of work around ritual in the African context and how we can kind of learn from and integrate those approaches into our lives in the kind of more industrialized West. But also people like Martin Practel, Stephen Jenkinson, and I think just generally Adrienne Marie Brown feels like an inspiration for my everyday existence, but also for grief work, which more and more she's orienting towards. So yeah, I feel like I've been kind of speaking a lot, and I might just share my screen if I can share my screen. We'll see if I can become a host maybe. And I can give you a little overview of the toolkit and then drop it in the chat in case you want to download it. Oh, I'm a co-host. Lovely. Thank you. Okay, bear with me, dear people. I will try and do this as smoothly as possible. Okay, so hide the scary desktop. So yeah, we have these illustrations by Jem D'Souza, who I really adore. And you can kind of scroll through a good amount of the contents here and also click through. But if you want the full version, then you can download it for free. You just have to kind of give an email address to Gen, because part of it for us is we really want to hear from people about how these practices are being integrated into community, if they're working for you, what they open up. We understand that they may need to be applied in different cultural contexts in different ways. So we're just really interested to see how the life of the toolkit emerges. Yeah, there's context around lineage, around grief in general. And I'm just going to scroll through to some personal practices. We also, through this process, have used a kind of embodiment framework, integrating the resilience toolkit, which is a somatic modality I'm certified in, which is really about encouraging people to have greater awareness of sensation in the body and of our stress shifts. So actually learning, what does it feel like when I'm becoming stressed? What are the signs in my body? And what tools could I use to kind of reduce that or to come towards more grounding or rootedness in the body? And so we use this as a kind of framework with the grief tools, so that if there's moments of overwhelm, people can kind of take a break or come back to the body, because given that grief is so taboo in the Western context, spending time with it may feel overwhelming a little. So part of this is also, how do we use our agency to notice what we need? If we need a break, if we need to do an embodied practice, how can we continue coming back to ourselves and being responsive to our needs? So yeah, there's some personal practices here around building an altar, if that's interesting for you, if you want to be in connection with ancestors or honoring those. The grief jar, which is a really lovely kind of easeful one to start with. A dance-based one that I've used for quite a while. Pillow screaming, which is great to work with rage. There's a lot more too if you download, so you can do that at the bottom. And I'm going to post the link right now so that you'll have access to that. on this launch day. Yay! Mm, 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 mm. Yeah. So that's posted in the chat there for you all. And I suppose something else I could speak about a little is, yeah, in my practice, I suppose I'm quite interested in weaving theory with kind of more symbolic, embodied content. So during the time of the research, I was reached out to by Performing Borders Live, and they commissioned me to make a new piece of work. And I was so busy with all these grief practices and thinking about how can this be more accessible and more playful? You know, how can I make it fun or inviting for people? And so I made I think 17-minute short film that's got some kind of low budget sci-fi overtones called The Grief Portal. And this was an exercise in kind of inviting another way of engaging people to just be in conversation with grief a little bit more. So yeah, I can play a little bit of that. I won't play the whole thing, but maybe I'll play the intro. And again, I can post the link in case you want to go through the whole journey. So I will do that now. I found it. Yes, here it is. And I'm hoping the sound works out okay. We shall see. Fingers crossed. Putting the sound in stereo. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I'm a deep, deep lover of science fiction, and at the moment a lot of my film work has been very low budget sci-fi. Maybe one day bigger budget sci-fi, who knows. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can hear that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Fab.
Welcome. You have made it through the portal. This is a space to recover what has been lost and forgotten. A space to connect with grief and the generative gifts it can bring. First, we need to connect with the body to facilitate this journey. I invite you to orient to the space that you are in. You can do this by moving your head and neck slowly, looking around you, taking in the space you currently inhabit. As you move, I invite you to notice any colors that stand out to you, any textures or objects that bring you joy. I invite you to notice any smells, any tastes that you can taste. Staying with your breath, I invite you to notice the sensation of your clothing against your skin. And coming to find stillness. Next, I invite you to connect with your body by placing one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly. As you breathe, noticing the feeling of the connection with these parts of your body. Noticing any sensations moving through you in this moment. Any feelings of comfort or grounding that this connection brings. And coming to find stillness once again. At this moment, your planet is at a crossroads. Humans must either decide to relinquish their dominance to sustain the web of life, or face widespread death and destruction. Grief is necessary in order to compost the old and grow new futures from the fertile soil of your loss. Collective wounds lay dormant and unaddressed. The trauma of colonization, patriarchy, borders, deep inequality rest heavy on the body. You must tend to this pain, address the dirty laundry that has been unaddressed for so many generations. You must do this work not only for yourself, but for your ancestors and the future beings to come. I invite you to take a moment to connect with some of this grief, with some of this sensing in your body. Once again, connect with the body in a way that feels comfortable to you. As maybe a hand on the chest, a hand on your belly. And as you breathe, you may close your eyes if this feels comfortable to you. I'd like you to become aware of any sensations arising in your body. And I invite you to find somewhere in the body that feels pleasurable, that feels good, without you having to do anything to it. I'd like you to ask this part of your body, how can you befriend your grief? How can you befriend your grief? The invitation is to move in service of this desire to get closer, to be in connection to your grief as an opening. I'm going to move with what moves for me. You are invited to do the same if you were called to do so. If not, you can watch, be present for this movement journey.
Sorry for the abrupt stop, but I have to stop at some point. So yeah, that's just a little taster of this experiment that was the Grief Portal. And yeah, you're very welcome to yeah, to go along with the exercises and have a move and see if that, yeah, um, brings up anything for you. So, yeah. Um, yeah, so Hal, I don't know if you, and maybe we're just doing the discussion at the end, or are we kind of weaving before I change more towards embodied social justice?
I personally would like you just to go through, because
Okay,
I
great.
think embodied social justice is really important. I'm a bit worried we kind of sort of just
Yeah,
shrink it, so we have a little bit at the end.
okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Cool. Great. So, yeah, that's a little bit of the kind of grief explorations I've been doing. And I suppose in bringing it into connection with the rest of my practice, or the certain parts of my practice that are related to embodiment and social change, I'm going to segue in and speak a little bit about that. So yeah, I suppose in 2014, I was introduced to the term somatics, and I was living in California at the time, and I just was like, what is that? I don't really understand what it is, but it sounds really cool. And people are like, well, it's around using your body to explore different sensations and how they link to trauma and this. And I was like, I don't really get it, but I want to get it. And yeah, it's kind of just been an ongoing exploration since there, really. I was introduced to a lot of different practices living in the Bay Area for a few years that really were instrumental to me in, yeah, introducing me to the ways that embodied practice and activism were much more interconnected than I'd ever experienced in the European context. I remember kind of meeting my then partner in 2012, and the Black Lives Matter movement was flourishing at that time. There was a lot of energy and really nourishing care networks, and what I thought were very sophisticated structures to really support the movement. Some of you who are interested in embodiment might have come across the work of Prentice Hemphill. And at the time, Prentice was the director of Healing Justice for Black Lives Matter. So as much as there were actions that, we might have been seeing through media outlets of people in the street, there were also just as much work happening around getting low-cost acupuncture to people, having healing justice circles, really actually noticing the ways that people showing up to protest and resist racist oppression was also going to take a toll and bring up the wounds of that trauma within people. And so they were actively, as a movement, organizing around how to support people in that time. To not only be present in the streets, but to also heal and integrate and be with that trauma and allow it to compost and to shift and to become generative. And this was incredibly inspiring to me, having been rooted in a lot of activist spaces in the UK that, yeah, just didn't feel that nourishing, if I'm honest. I've done a lot of Palestinian solidarity work over the years, a lot of LGBTQ plus organizing, some environmental organizing as well. And in most of those spaces, I'd say they were quite disembodied. They were often, I'd say, quite fueled by alcohol and substance use as a way to cope with the trauma of going on protest and maybe being kettled, or just navigating and thinking about so many of these issues around systemic harm and violence. So I was kind of aware that, yeah, I'm for this. I want to be part of this change, but the way that this is being organized and the ways that we're relating to each other, to me, don't feel like part of what we're trying to create. It was very much this: when the revolution comes, we'll fix this and this and that, and but right now we know we're not going to be busy with that because that's frivolous until the revolution comes. And I was much more like, well, can't we practice and do culture change that allows us to move closer to where we want to be and really do that on a small level with each other? And they're like, no, that's naive. We don't have time to be busy with that. So finding this community in California was just like super nurturing to me and provided me with a lot of the tools and the avenues for further research, which has kind of shaped my interest in these interconnections between embodiment and trauma and social change. So I think one of the kind of core premises for most of my work in this area, or the explorations that I'm interested in, is a real sense that embodiment is necessary for social transformation. Policy and legislation change will only get us so far on their own. So I think that policy is something that's very important. I am still a bit of a policy nerd, but I think it has to be hand in hand with very intentional awareness about how our bodies are relating to other bodies and relating to the earth, and how our nonverbal communication a lot of the time is unconsciously enacting and reproducing systems of power and hierarchy. So if we don't learn to actually listen in, to quiet down and notice these very small exchanges we're having that are reproducing these forms of dominance, whether that's around racism, patriarchy, ableism, etc., then we won't really be able to use the agency that we do have to take some accountability for how we are showing up and engaging, and on a kind of individual, interpersonal, and community level. So I started to get really interested with that piece. Like, how do we use our bodies and use embodied practice to start to notice these patterns, to really open them up, and to use our agency to make small pivots, to change our behavior, to change the ways we're relating, so that we can hopefully move away from dynamics based on dominance towards interdependence. And so I began to run workshops when I moved back to the UK that were kind of mixing different embodiment practices with a little bit of theory, but then quite big dance movement explorations, which were usually around a prompt of something like, how do legacies of colonization show up in my body? And then having space to kind of improvise and move with that, to notice what the wisdom of the body will tell us, because we often think that we have to just sit there and be really busy in our heads and find the right solutions. But there's actually a huge amount of wisdom that will come up if we ask the body and then allow it to kind of guide us and show us maybe some of the things we need to look at. It might bring us particular memories or sensations that give insight about the thing that we're working with. So I started to run quite a lot of these spaces, sometimes in conjunction with different arts festivals, or again, Performing Borders Live. I was working with quite a lot doing this work. And it also had a big overlap with my freelance work at the time, which I was running a small organization called the Collective Liberation Project that was doing a lot of embodied anti-racism consultancy and training for mostly nonprofits, but also some arts organizations as well. So for a time, I was really, very interested in, how does this apply in a work context? How does it apply in a community context? What are the different tools we can use? And in the context of going into organizations, it was much more facilitation and exercises and theory and discussion. But with the community spaces, I was a lot more experimental and really weaving in a lot more dance practice into those as well. So that was taking shape for a long time and continues to be a big part of my practice, though the kind of racial justice piece is not as dominant right now, because I found myself going through some periods of burnout and trying to consistently work with that material in my art practice, and also for my kind of sustenance through my work. So yeah, at the moment I am taking a little bit of space and working out how I can be in relationship to that material again, even though it does feel like it runs through everything I do, but I'm just not overtly doing kind of anti-racism trainings right now. I'm also going to show a little video for those of you that may be a little bit more new to this overlap of kind of embodiment and social justice work. This was a cute little 5-minute film that was made with some master's students at the University of Sussex, which is where I used to go, and I studied international relations just over 10 years ago. So I was really like a politics nerd that's kind of more and more finding myself in the arts, which I don't have a problem with. But this lovely little film was something that we made together called Bodies for Change, which is sort of exploring some of these themes and introducing these connections.
Ver el avance de los discursos de odio producidos principalmente por la derecha y la extrema derecha alrededor del mundo.
E também pelo estado socioambiental do planeta.
I think this wave that we're seeing of racism and nationalism, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing and something that I'm very worried about for the future.
El futuro de las infancias trans y por ser obligado a ser alguien que uno no es.
Una de les coses que em preocupa d'aquest moment social i global és el pensament neoliberal.
Ser uma mulher latino-americana.
We can have our individual ways of viewing ourselves, but as soon as we walk out into the world, we will be treated certain ways, depending on our skin color, depending on the language that we speak, our class background, our gender, our sexuality. We can't necessarily get rid of those things because they are so bound in our bodies and the way that our bodies experience the world. How do I explain myself? Well, my name's Camille. I'm a non-binary queer artist. My art and also the business that I run is underpinned by research in somatic social justice. So really trying to fuse understandings of the body and how trauma is stored in the body and relating that to social justice issues like racism and sexism, understanding how those things actually relate directly to our bodies, the trauma we carry and how we move through the world. In the Western context, there's quite a separation of mind and body, and people try to often regard the mind as much more important, and the body is kind of just this thing that, you know, we just have, we don't necessarily need to pay attention to, or doesn't really have anything to tell us.
Crec que els cossos són els primers perjudicats.
I can really feel it in my chest, like my heart will beat faster if I'm very, very worried about something.
और मेरा कोई भी काम करने का मन नहीं करता.
A la panxa, a un estat alterat es transforma el meu cos.
It makes me not so much angry as anxious.
El meu cos reacciona amb ansietat.
Se me contractura el cuello, migrañas.
My neck will tense up.
I notice the trauma that exists in the world, and for me, art has been a really crucial way to start healing that and understanding the tension that's stored in different parts of my body, the way that my body reacts when I'm experiencing racism or when I'm feeling on the margins. think that using movement and working with the body in relationship to social change is incredibly important, because we then get to reconnect with and understand how much information this really gives us and how crucial it is in terms of mapping out the trauma, the blockages, the way we respond to certain people. So I think the body has a crucial role to play in that.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like, oh, blast from the past. Yeah, so that's maybe just a exploration of some of those themes. But for those that maybe are a bit more interested in the really amazing neuroscience that's happening to kind of support a deeper understanding of how trauma is really imprinted and held in the body, I highly recommend The Body Keeps the Score, putting it in the chat, by Bessel van der Kolk. And Bessel is a psychotherapist and neuroscientist who's been doing a lot of work with predominantly veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder. And he's done numerous studies with them over decades and decades of research, kind of noticing, I guess, whether talk therapy and modalities like this are actually helpful. They don't tend to be. Prior to MDMA psychotherapy and other psychedelic therapies, which I'll start talking about soon, EMDR, which is a type of rapid eye movement therapy, was the sort of most successful kind of in studies at kind of treating PTSD. And now we're seeing that many psychedelic assisted therapies are showing even more promise in a therapeutic context to kind of heal PTSD and allow people to repattern and regain more agency of their bodies and kind of moving away from things like flashbacks. But what's interesting in this book is kind of, an overview of what's really happening in the brain, how that's connecting to the body, and his kind of suggestion that is body-based practices that really help us to repattern and create new ways of existing, new shapes that we take as we inhabit different contexts of our lives, to really recover from trauma. And I sort of noticed I said heal, and actually that's something I don't really say anymore. In my understanding of it, I like to think of it, as my teacher NChem and Defo would say, as repatterning, because actually when we experience trauma, that is something that can really change the shape that we take, right? The way that we move through space. And so I find it more helpful now to think of it as repatterning, to create new ways of existing, taking new shapes as we exist in different parts of our lives, different contexts. I could say a lot more about this, but I will segue now to the last kind of main area of my work and practice, which is around drug policy and advocating within the psychedelic assisted therapy space. Some of you might have noticed the kind of mainstreaming of psychedelics that's happening and the amount of attention they're receiving. There are a lot of exciting studies taking place, even within the UK, like at Imperial College in London. They've been doing a lot of scientific research looking at how psilocybin can be used to treat treatment-resistant depression. And those studies have actually shown quite promising results in that psilocybin is seen as just as, if not more effective than SSRIs, which are the standard antidepressants that many are prescribed for long-standing depression. But over in the US, you've also got Johns Hopkins University that have been doing similar studies comparing SSRIs and psilocybin. And you have MAPS, an organization that I've done consultancy with for some years now, who are the main clinical sponsor for MDMA psychotherapy, which looks like it will have FDA approval within the next year or so, hopefully. And in the European and UK context, we're a good 5 to 10 years behind, really, on that journey. But studies, phase 3 studies, are taking place in the UK and in Europe as well. And what I find really interesting about this moment with psychedelic assisted therapies is that they hopefully will herald a really new approach to mental health and how we navigate mental health experiences in our society. Because a lot of the ways that these protocols for psychedelic assisted therapy sessions are developing is they're moving away from this kind of dominance model of having a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst kind of pathologize you and tell you, this is what's wrong with you, that's what's wrong with you, you need to do X, Y, Z to get better. And it really turns that model on its head, and instead the mental health practitioner in the space during a session becomes more like a facilitator, someone that's supporting the inner healing intelligence of the client. So there's this idea or understanding that all of us have the potential and capacity to understand how we can heal, how we can repattern trauma that we've experienced. And so the mental health practitioner in that case becomes someone who's just supporting that process, who's just helping us in moments where we might get a little bit blocked or we might need a reframe or a check-in. And so it's really changing what that relationship looks like. And I hope that we'll see a lot of reform to the mental health system. Of course, I don't expect this to just happen overnight and by itself, but I think the advocates involved, and for those of us who choose to invest in the space, I think there's a lot of scope to really, to really change how things operate in that realm. For me, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make these therapies accessible to Black people and to communities of color and those who have been predominantly harmed by the war on drugs. Because, unless there are very intentional policy changes that are made, then these psychedelic assisted therapies will mostly be available to wealthier white people in the global north. And we already see that's how therapy works anyway in the world. So I'm quite invested in making sure that for communities of color and LGBT folks and those that maybe don't receive very good care right now in the mental or medical systems, that there can be a quality of care that can be received that's robust if they do choose to use these treatments, and that providers are thinking about implementing sliding scale practices, that they're thinking about and actively training therapists from these backgrounds who have an understanding of the trauma that the war on drugs continues to play in many communities. So that's kind of another facet of my life and work. And I haven't really decided if I'll become a psychedelic therapist one day. I'm currently leaning towards no, but if there's a way to integrate it with dance approaches and somatics in the future, that may be a thing. But at the moment, I'm mostly kind of, involved in the policy elements and trying to just draw attention to how much the war on drugs is really a mechanism for social and racial control. It's never really been about the drugs. It's mostly about who you can police, who you can incarcerate, who you can criminalize because of them. And we're seeing this very, very starkly now as cannabis becomes so much more available and legal in many parts of the US, as psychoactive substances also do. And yet it's the same communities who are being incarcerated, even in states where marijuana is now legal. You've still got Black and brown people in prison for personal possession. So I really hope that we can begin to address these inequities. And I do think it's actually a strategic move for those invested in racial justice to actually learn about drug policy and the war on drugs, because I think it's really one of the main vehicles for how racism is perpetuated in society, and a really big connection with a lot of police murders that we're seeing as well. So yeah, I feel like I've been speaking for a long time, so I might stop there. And that's a good point, Sahil, and then we can, I don't know, segue to something.
Yeah, I just want to speak more.
Okay.
Going. This is great. It's really enriching. Yeah, maybe let me ask a couple of questions, and then you can see there's a few hands up, at least one. So firstly, thank you. Just in terms of what you've given, but also I think the work you're doing is quite extraordinary in both the practicality of I mean, speaking from the art space, the practicality of what you do seems really significant, because you're using creative practices in a way that's very directly involved and transformative for the people for yourself, for the people you're working with. And I think that's really worth bearing in mind. Secondly, I think that for me anyway, when you were speaking about how you were experiencing a lot of burnout and exhaustion, and sort of a sense of these causes are well and good, but the personal cost is so great when you're involved in activism. I think this is something that those of us involved in the strike can very much identify with, because there's a lot of, just very immediately, there's a strong sense that, the strike is the right thing to do. It's kind of like there's a protest to be had both nationally and at Goldsmiths about what's going on and so on. But I think a lot of our staff and students are just burnt out and just a bit busted by it. And being involved in discussions about what to do next really doesn't pay any attention to the demand of that discussion itself. So I thought there's something really encouraging about, especially, I think the concern is what do people do, what do students do, what do staff do during the strike period. And as I said at the beginning, I think in the previous round of strikes we had a few years ago around pensions, there was a lot of people, the students were organizing, self-organizing quite a lot. And that actually seemed to help people not just get through the period, but in the aftermath of it as well. There was a sense that what students could get from being on the program was, certainly there was a kind of deficit in terms of what the program was providing, but people could make their own, could learn from each other. There's a lot of skill sharing, for example, and kind of communal activities like film viewing and the rest of it. But again, I think that's partly compromised by COVID, but I think there's just something in that moment about how we attend to ourselves as we're engaged with or kind of called upon by these kind of large, somewhat abstract political actions, which it's a really good time to hear that right now, the week before we go. So I think I've got a bit more to open up around that stuff. But I've got, I guess, two questions, but I'll just ask one and then come back to the other one, maybe if there's time later on. You mentioned the word composting a lot. You mentioned at the beginning when you were talking about how, the kind of attention economy that we're in is basically externalize your attention. So from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, you're just like in front of a blue screen, basically, or kind of feeling the kind of demand to find out what's next. It's not just through like screen actions, but it happens a lot. And then you mentioned it again in terms of, it's a kind of description of a process of grieving, and also as a process of understanding where one is as you're finding your way through these various sort of like political moments, or engaging with these kind of social conflicts.
Mm.
And I just wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you came to the term composting and sort of why you like it so much.
Thank you for the question. I feel like, nature is a contested term. I'm just going to go with it for now. I think, we are part of nature, but we haven't got the language to have another word that describes that. But I think we can learn a lot from nature. I'm very inspired by biomimicry, thinking about innovations or how we can live in a way that supports and sustains life by learning from the patterns and relationships that we see in the natural world. And so I think composting is just that to me. It's, how do we essentially get nutrients from the waste? And what we might think, oh, I just need to discard that, whether it's rage, whether it's bad feeling, whether it's, I don't know, something we're outgrowing. What can we learn if we allow ourselves to be with that process of breaking down, of transforming, of letting go of certain things, of synthesizing what we want to keep, extracting the nutrients and discarding the rest, but really being with that process, because I feel that, with this kind of limited attention to ourselves and being so distracted and, orienting outwards all the time, I think we sometimes do ourselves a disservice and are missing these kind of opportunities to go through cycles of completion, because we're just on to the next. I know I still do it a lot of the time, and I'm really trying to learn, what does completion look like? Like, how long should I give completion? And even thinking about the context of the grief toolkit, I'm like, it's done now. Instead of just thinking about the next thing, I'm making myself kind of honor the cycle of completion and giving myself a number of things to do to be with that process. But I also think for me, composting feels generative as an idea or something I sit with, because I feel like I do agree when I hear certain people refer to capitalist culture, late stage capitalist culture, as kind of death cult culture. There's not very much honoring of life or the life cycle. There's not so much of an honoring of our bodies. We're very much treated like machines, and more living in an economic system that's trying to mechanize us and our bodies. And I do feel that as much as we talk about decolonizing, and there's a lot of conversation about these things, what does that look like on an embodied level? That will look like actually having to let go of a lot of different ways of being, to actually change our shape, to repattern and move away from a lot of the ways that we just do things automatically. And I think composting has to be part of that process. There'll be some things we want to keep, and there'll be others that no longer are going to be appropriate for where we want to move to, for how we want to live or relate in service of life. And so I'm personally a little bit tired of these conversations which are so rational, theoretical, decolonize this, that, when no one's talking about the body response. No one's talking about the way people are coming for each other left, right, and center, because everyone's putting each other on a pedestal of perfectionism and existing in these colonial binaries that won't allow for, thinking outside of either or. So yeah, it feels important to me because I do feel we need to take more time to be with processes, learn from what's happening around us, if we're not going to make the same mistakes and just be operating in the same rhythms that we're trying to move away from. I think it will take some more space and ability to be with things as they break down, and then really become more responsive rather than just be reactive, which is, I think, even what's happening in a lot of our academic and learning spaces that use the language to suggest they're different, but the process and the embodied relating is the same.
Okay, sorry, I had a feline interruption. There's to see Jean-François and Roz. Sorry, Maria, shouldn't be doing you.
I don't mind. But
who was first?
So we have Jean-François is first. So Jean-Francois, would you please turn on your video as well while you're asking this question?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if my internet is working. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was really amazing. I wanted to ask some, like a lot of things, but maybe to make it short, you mentioned that sometimes a more positive approach to trauma where you actually believe that you can heal it, although I understand you don't want to use the word healing too much anymore, but you mentioned sometimes it's read as naive, and I think it's actually really sad, but what do you do in this case when an embodied approach and transformative approach is used? It's maybe misunderstood as some kind of maybe it can be taken as something a bit easy. And also, is there a kind of hierarchy of knowledge between a very embodied practice and the knowledge of the body, and a more intellectual approach to trauma even? And like as a kind of side question, but it's also related, you mentioned that you felt it was more accepted in California than in the UK, and I would be really interested to hear about the cultural difference, maybe regarding the body, how people are using their body and how it affects the perception of your work.
Thank you for the questions. I suppose the first piece, to be honest, I'm still working it out. And it's something which the cohort I work with and the program I'm running, Ecologies of Transformation, they're often wondering how to do this as well, because a few of them have come from very traditional activist organizing. We're doing all this embodiment stuff, and they're feeling like so much resistance towards organizing in the ways they were before, but they want to bring their communities with them, and it's a tension that's coming up. And if I'm totally honest, I don't know what it looks like to bring people along, because I think so much of maybe the reframe that I'm noticing in myself is that I choose to be active where I can, but there's a lot of this that to me involves people having to be ready to meet me. And as much as I can say, you need to come with me, you need to come, this is the way, if they're not ready for that, I can't drag them there. So I don't mean that as an absolute, like there's no point trying. I'm really interested in what are these mechanisms we can use to make things more inviting, to make them playful, to make them appealing. But I do think to an extent we can only offer a door and people have to choose to walk through it. So that's what I would say to the first one. And for a lot of the people who would say things like, that's so naive, I honestly am not really in connection with them anymore. There were people I organized with when I was at university. I have, warm feeling towards them. If I saw them, I would love to have a catch up, but I'm definitely more surrounded with people who I think have a bit more of a holistic approach, because that felt necessary to me, and that's kind of how it's gone for me with that. The second piece of your question was about healing and trauma, right?
It was maybe how you feel that it's the cultural difference between the UK and California, for example, and how your work is accepted more, not accepted, but like perceived, or
yeah. It's an interesting one. I think that California in particular was a real home to the human development movement. I don't know if you've heard about that, and kind of a lot of the stuff that was happening in the 60s with people experimenting, not just with psychedelics, but free love, but also setting up different psychedelic churches and different kind of ritual embodied processes and practices. And I think those legacies are really, really ongoing. And also I think culturally, something I noticed with living there, I think this has positives and negatives because I think it creates people like Donald Trump. But a lot of people in the States, when they believe something or they're into it, they're really into it and they're going to really go for it. And there's a kind of sometimes maniacal optimism that can be present on the West Coast. And I think when it's in relation to things I'm interested in, great because I could just feel myself, steeped in all this amazing conversation and practice and people really wanting to experiment and explore things and feeling less afraid, I think, of getting it wrong, just wanting to try. Whereas I feel in the UK, there's quite a heavy culture of self-deprecation and, feeling small. And I guess even the monarchy, makes people feel small and know their place. And I think there's a big disconnect from the body in the UK. Western culture generally, though California, as I said, it has its own thing going on in some parts. But I also felt growing up in the UK that it was really rare I'd ever be in a social situation without alcohol. And I think that's something that lubricates and allows people to connect in ways that they otherwise would feel too afraid to. Whereas in California, I didn't have that experience. I actually stopped drinking when I moved there because people could connect in very deep and intimate ways, and alcohol wasn't a part of that. So I think maybe those are some of the differences I noticed. I think I also should say I was in a very particular bubble. I don't want to portray this to be like all of California is like this. It's a very actually divergent and more conservative state than people realize. But the bubble I was living in was this real wellspring of embodied social justice, peer counseling, clown joy. And it was very, very formative for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jean-Francois. Next, we have Ross.
Hi, Camille. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. It's just been incredible to hear you talk about what you've been doing and these different sort of overlapping projects, and also just how exciting to have you with us on the day of the launch of your toolkit. So thank you for being here. There's so many different things that really sort of resonate, but I actually watched a video of you a few months ago talking about your Ecologies of Transformation, MA, and was incredibly excited about the way in which you were talking about kind of social relations and reconnections through the mycelial as a kind of, amongst other kind of concepts. And so just sort of thinking about some of the kind of themes that you've been talking us through, and I really appreciate the way that you did that with so much kind of care and careful attention to the sort of pacing of that. I'd just really love to ask you about how that pop-up MA is going. Like, what has that experience been like? And it sounds incredible to, just sort of think about my own quite long now experience of education and academia, and how it's been this sort of struggle to sort of, in a way, unlearn the sort of overemphasis on the cerebral. And I'm kind of just really curious about if you could just say a bit more about what that experience has been like to have this, I imagine, opportunity to sort of do this deep work with what looked like an incredible group of people, some of whom I know their practice a little bit. So yeah, it's a very basic question, really.
Can I just, before you get to that, Camille, for people who don't know, Roz has just started the MA in Art and Ecology at Goldsmiths. So it's a deep personal commitment in this question.
Very excited about composting as well. We can have another long chat sometime about composting, hopefully.
Nice, I would love that. It's been quite a journey, to be honest. I kind of like developed the program in isolation during the pandemic and during the grief research, so that was quite hectic. And yeah, I'm still learning to slow down and find a rhythm and a pace that's sustainable. I love the group I'm working with. They're really incredible, and seeing the connections they have with each other is such a joy, because I know that's not always the case with groups that come together, and there's a beautiful synergy between them. For me, honestly, I think I had to acknowledge some grief that I had, because I've kind of developed my dream program in a way, and I'm not taking the course. I'm like running it and doing operations on it. So there was definitely some like, oh, I'm just like wanting this so badly to exist and being so glad it does, and then kind of realizing, oh, but this isn't this isn't how I get to engage with this thing. Okay. So there's been a process of shifting and accepting and kind of grieving what I thought it would be, maybe, and then settling into the reality of what it means to be the head of this program and exist in an institutional context again. But yeah, it feels like we've done a lot already, and it's beautiful to see the impact that embodiment work is having for them as a group, because I've very much been close to my own unfolding and ongoing journey with it, and I know how much it's done for me and is doing for me, and yet to really see it even in the space of, I don't know, 4 or 5 months that we've been working together now, and it's it's validating and like beautiful confirmation that this can be really powerful, and I think I'm finding a kind of rhythm with it and excited for the rest of the time and just trying to enjoy it as much as possible, because it's this one-time fleeting experience. So yeah, I feel like I've caught up with myself enough now, and it's like, okay, now it's about enjoying as much as I can, and and also getting stuck into more collaborative work, because the mycelial network is such an important kind of theme or metaphor for how we're working, and I'm really looking forward to getting more stuck into that, because we've been doing a lot of foundation building, and now it's like getting ready to be more playful and experimental. So yeah, I guess it's been many things, but right now it feels pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Camille. So we have next Charlotte.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk and for sharing your work. I just had a question quite related to the hierarchy of knowledge question. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the relationship of the work that you do with the somatic compared to other mediums that you work with, for example, the written work that you do. So if there's some aspect of it that can be translated between the two, or what the somatic work does that maybe the written work doesn't do, and vice versa, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I'm not so big into hierarchy, but if I had to work with that, I would say that embodied knowledge is something I prioritize, definitely, as a way to pivot from Cartesian dualism, or this like body-mind separation that's so dominant in Western culture and very much part of the colonial project as well. So I do prioritize embodied knowledge, but to me that's not limited to like, oh, there has to be dancing or there has to be clowning. I feel that my embodied experience is also something that's translating into my writing and the way I write, and also in wanting my writing to be accessible. Something I really struggled with in academia when I was studying was certain theorists. Okay, I'm just going to name and shame. I love Judith Butler, and also I can't stand the way Judith Butler writes. I find super inaccessible. And I'm like, okay, cool, I can understand this, but it takes me a while to really, I feel like I have to work at it. And I prefer an experience of reading and digesting and experiencing knowledge that is more metaphorical, more visual, and just easily digestible. So I think that even though if I am doing something that's writing, which we would see as cerebral and rational in our kind of Western context, I think somatic practice and noticing the felt sensation of what I would like people to be experiencing with it also really comes in for me. And so I don't think it's a binary. It feels like very interconnected with how I do things. And yeah, but if I had to prioritize, I'd say that comes first, because I'm relearning how to inhabit my body and be with it in a world that seems to be structured around being as disembodied as possible. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. So that was the last question that we've had in terms of raised hands. Does anyone else have? Oh, Jean-Francois would like to ask another question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we do. We have, Sohail, we have enough time, right?
Yeah, I've got one more as well. So just like, but also,
and there's also another person that popped up as well. So I guess that's 3 people in total, including Sohail. So Jean-Francois, do you want to ask your question? Then we'll go to Juliet and then Sohail. What do you think, Sohail? Is that okay?
I can drop mine. It's okay. Let's just do Jean-Francois and Juliet, and then I think that Camille have a rest. It's like,
yeah, thank you for that. So my question is related to, I mean, could you say a few words about you shift from healing to repatterning? I think it's, I would be interested in hearing that. And maybe, but I know there are other questions, but if you could say the role of plants in your work. I mean, I know it's a huge question, but I think it's very interesting because you use the idea of composting and I think also psychedelics, they immediately relate to plants. And so I was wondering, yeah, if you could say a few words about it, but you don't have to.
Sure, thank you. So the first question around healing versus repatterning. The main thing I notice with this is that in the wellness industry, I feel like there's this kind of hyper-consumption individualist model that I see very closely related to this concept of original sin. I think it's a cultural thing. It's not that I think that everyone's a Christian. I know there's many non-Christian people living in the West, but it seems to be this kind of sense of like, oh, there's something wrong with me. It's dirty. I need healing, 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 endless healing. You know, it's like, when does it end? And that's part of my resistance to it. And the other piece is that because trauma, many researchers around it would argue, changes our shape, if we can heal it or if we can move past it, we're actually integrating it, right? We're allowing it to become us, but allowing ourselves to expand, to not constrict with it, to not stay locked in a particular region or position, but to kind of expand and grow with it, right? And so to me, that's a bit more like repatterning. It's not like it's been thrown away. It's there, but it's now part of us in a way that allows us to still live fully and to be big and to be expansive. So those are the kind of reasons for me with that. And it's not to say that, you know, I think it's wrong that people refer to it as healing. I definitely in my life may still use the word, but if I'm talking about trauma generally and ways to engage with it or to move beyond it, I feel like repatterning, just kind of skips that original sin, hyper wellness, individual culture thing. And then the other piece around plants, I think I'm learning how to be in relationship to non-human actors. You know, like many of you have grown up in this very Western hierarchical society where humans are seen to be the beings that matter and everything else is down there. And I don't believe this in my heart or in my head, but that's how I've been conditioned. So there's a lot of unlearning and shifting that's taking place and probably will continue to throughout my life. And so one of the ways that plants factor in there is that, I'd say I prioritize them as teachers. They're friends to me, they're allies. They support my well-being in many ways, shape, or form. And even before I was interested in psychoactive substances, my mother is a very witchy herbalist being, and so I've learned a lot of that from her, and both of us have had health conditions to navigate, and so plants have been the ultimate healers and friends in just helping me day to day. So I'm working on changing my relationship with them and just being in right relationship with them and the land more, and it's taking its time. It's definitely something I need to practice, but I suppose that's how it sits for me, of just one of the sites of relationship change that I'm working on.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have Juliet lastly.
Hello. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your lecture, your talk. It has been very, very inspiring, and I wanted to say that I relate to a lot of what you've been saying about this critique of academic space as with this body-mind separation that is very Western concept, and I do also feel this miss of connection to the body in this university in Goldsmith space. I come from a bachelor where there was much more performances in where I come from, and so it's also something I've been thinking about a lot, on how can I create a space here in the MFA with students to learn how to learn also and teach and engage with each other through the body. But I also found it quite complicated, and I think I'm still like trying to learn to think about how to create those spaces. And I think that the time that we've been the closest to creating that was during the last day of the strike last time with the collective Black Gold. On the last day we did a meditation session, and it was incredibly interesting to just start this process. And we organized it last minute, so there was actually only us and Rihanna, who was here, another tutor at Goldsmith. But it was also nice to, like, between just being ourselves, to learn how we can maybe then bring this to other people. Anyway, so I guess my question is simple, but do you have any advice on how to just start, like, concretely create spaces like this in an academic space? And I guess this question is also addressed to the students here who are listening, if there is people interested in gathering for sharing session and sharing knowledge, but involving our body and practice in it.
Thank you for this question. I think something that can be really supportive over time is to, if you have consent from your class, that is, and from your the facilitators you're working with, is to maybe start every session with an embodied practice. It could be different people that would lead it. And also, I mean, that's what we do with the group I work with, but also if there's something coming up in the discussion, or there's something that brings up a trauma memory for people, we also are getting into the habit of doing another practice. So there's a moment to kind of reground and reconnect with the body. And so I think there's little rituals and ways you could play with it like that potentially. But also I really advocate for self-experimentation, and even if at the moment it's just you trying things out at home or with, one or two friends, and thinking about bringing that to a small group who want to join. I think there's a real power in being experimental, and again trusting our own embodied wisdom and just sharing what we noticed. And you might have different insights on different days, but that might start to develop frameworks and areas for play and for inquiry. So I think, allow yourself to have fun with it. And if there's an area that you desire, like, oh, I really miss dancing, maybe there's a possibility that even on a, I don't know, wintry London day, dare I say it, that you might even meet in a park and or have like a shared Spotify playlist. I'm meant to be boycotting Spotify. I'm not trying to suggest Spotify, but for example, something like Spotify. And you could, I was going to these when I was living in Berlin, where we'd all be socially distanced, but in a park with our headphones, and we'd press play at the same time, and we'd have these like group distant dance sessions. So I'd say, move from a place of desire and feel free to experiment. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the questions as well. For Juliet, if I may say, in response to your one, as one of the oppressive forces of like, we do it before. My sense is that, certainly on the MFA Fine Art, and my guess is probably curating program as well, there are quite restricted ways in which we kind of do the teaching and sort of what happens in it and so on. And that's partly just habit, because we've kind of, but it's also evolved into that. So I think, that in a way, for all of the problems that the strike presents, I'm not trying to limit that. It does seem to me that when you have that space to try something else out and other forms of communication and collaboration and being with and near each other, and playing together as well, actually, which seems something that seems to be disappearing quite fast from the program, that people play together, then you should take it. You should take it. In a way, the teaching gets in the way of all of that stuff. And I also appreciate that people feel there's not been much teaching going on because it's been such an interrupted experience. So for me, it would be kind of the two. Like, you can have the formal aspects, but there's also other things that can happen as well, and then they can inform each other. But I think there's a moment now. I'm really glad that your presentation was today, Camille, because I think it's given us a way of going into this next difficult period, difficult for everyone in a way that maybe we can get something out of it, which is not just glum and not just sad and not just grieving that we're not getting or providing the education we should be. But that, there's people are still together. And I think now that COVID restrictions in the UK are much less, there seems to be a lot more activity and energy in studios. So it seems actually quite a good moment for people to kind of think about what they can do with one another. But I also think like there's actually been quite a lot of emotional sort of movement for me anyway through your talk. So it's kind of felt like it's arrived at a really good time. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'll send out the link to the toolkit to people through our communication system.
Great.
And then I'll be in touch with you a bit later. But I'm going to let you go because you've been very generous with your time. So we'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. And I hope that you all have a really nice evening. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. A virtual round of applause. Lots of thanks is in the chat box.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Thank you.
Great. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Follow up to this.
Sounds good.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh,
Hey, Maria.
hi, Sahil. I'm trying to see. I can't export the chat. I'm trying to find a little.
There's a save chat thing. Can you see it? If you go to your chat box.
Yes.
The three dots beside the emoji.
Yeah, it doesn't let me.
Okay, I've saved it. So just trying to find where it is. You can just do if you just do Apple A on the chat itself.
Okay, yeah, the whole just copy everything.
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
All right, thank you, Maria.
Oh, no worries, Sahil.
Okay.
And catch you soon.
Yeah, have a good evening. Oh, I'm going to stop the recording as well.
Okay.
Great.
Oh, Sahil, one more question.
Yeah.
I was about to upload last week's lecture on the VLE.
Okay.
Right? Is that what you're thinking of? So, and then this lecture next week.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so we're just staggering it. Okay, no problem.
Yeah, you've been able to access it through the Zoom.
Yes, but I'll have to. I don't think I downloaded it at the time, but I'll do that when I get back home. I'm actually on campus right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, no problem.
Great, thanks. Okay, see you. Bye, everyone.
Cheers, see you. Bye.